So excuse me for that. I will do that. And I wanted to mention a few details that I think one thing that had not been clearly understood, and we made it not sufficiently clear, is that the We Changers platform, which we've given you access to as a community platform, is something that you actually have access to after this masterclass as well as during the masterclass. So we encourage you to make yourself known there. If you haven't already done your profile, please do. Please enrich your profile by telling people who you are and what you're doing. And that will enable them to also include you in group discussions. So we encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to share resources with everyone in the group. We've shared a lot of resources with you. You can capture those resources by looking in the resources tab. It's on the left side of the We Changers platform page. But also note that there are things marked groups. You may establish groups of common interest that you might want to continue to work with and talk with as time goes by. So we encourage you to look at that as an opportunity as you've gotten to know people in this group that you wish to stay in touch with. You can share resources with one another easily that way. So just know that is an option that we have there for you. Now today in the session, we're going to be spending a lot of time in breakouts and we have formed groups for you. You saw an email from us. And if you didn't see that, you might take a look in your email box for it. And that email told you about the groups that we've assigned you to for the second part of this session. In the first part, you'll be in smaller groups, but then you will, in the second session, there will be second part of the session rather, there will be 2 breakout groups and you will be with the same group. And it's a group that we've tried to put together for common interest based on the information in your application. So we hope you'll find that an enriching experience as you do some group work today. And I want to now just welcome Sid Schwartz, Rabbi Sid Schwartz, who has very generously agreed to lead us in centering the group and preparing us for our work today with prayer. So Sid, may I turn it to you, please?
Yes, thank you, Anne. I appreciate the invitation to write a intention, a prayer, which I'm calling a prayer for social transformation and partnership, which I hope will set our intention for the day of learning with the Shoka. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2. And it shall come to pass that God's house shall be established at the top of the mountains, and all nations shall flow towards that house. And many people shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And God will teach us the way, and we will walk in those paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of God from Jerusalem. Isaiah offers us a vision of a time when people from all nations will come to know a greater truth. They will be of every race, religion, and ethnicity. There will be women and men, gay and straight, and those who are non-binary. They will be rich and poor. They will be abled and differently abled, geniuses and the autistic. There will be doctors and scientists and plumbers and even the cashier from the grocery store down the street. And every person will carry within them a spark of the divine. God, source of all wisdom, help us to understand that you have implanted within us the power to create a better world than the one we currently experience. We can end hunger because we have the resources to feed the entire world. We can end disease because we have the knowledge to create vaccines for healing. We can end war because we have the power to reason. We can bring our world into ecological balance because we already have the ability to create clean energy. We can end prejudice because once we have been to your mountaintop, we know that every person is infinitely precious and worthy of being treated with respect and with dignity. The Jewish morning prayers include the passage, every day humanity is empowered to renew the work of God's creation. So let us be partners with you to heal a broken world. And let us begin by reaching out to one another to begin the healing work of which we are fully capable. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Sid, for that wonderful opening. And now I'm going to turn our session over to Kenny Cluett. And Kenny and our colleague Mika Fennick are here today to work with you in the group work that we're going to take on today. Over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Thank you, Sid, for that prayer and blessing. Let me just introduce myself briefly. My name is Kenny Cluett. I'm based in Madrid, Spain. And within Ashoka, I lead our work with migration, something called Hello World. And I also lead Europe in identifying and selecting Ashoka Fellows, which is one of the core pieces of what we do as Ashoka. Also, just briefly, I have a deep journey or history in faith as well. I grew up in an evangelical tradition in the US and then in Spain. And I'm also an ordained pastor. And I worked full time as a pastor in the US and here for a while as well, before spending more time with Ashoka. So, you know, I'm really excited about everything that's going on here and just really thrilled to be here and see what comes out of this. Kind of transitioning from last week, you may remember we ended up talking about activating, or we talked about activating change makers, especially young change makers. And towards the end, we took a step back to kind of consider the magnitude of some of the problems we face. Do you remember that? We just looked at some of the big issues we face. And we mentioned that when we face massive problems, we cannot face them alone. We need new ways to engage in collective leadership. We need new ways to build structures and movements. And that's kind of what we want to concentrate on today. What are some of those tools we need to build things together? What are some of the tools we need to work on leadership together? And to start off with, I wanted to give you just a little example from my work in Ashoka. So this picture you see here was part of our co-creation work with what was called Hello Europe before. Now it's called Hello World. But brief history, 2015, we had what many journalists called the migration crisis, right? Which is actually a migration opportunity. We had about around 1 million migrants coming to Europe from mostly the Arab world and other areas. But our structures weren't working well to kind of integrate people, to get them, you know, in the right position so that they can start working, and for host communities to kind of welcome people. So we, as Ashoka, we got together with a bunch of partners and we said, how do we fix this? How do we contribute to this? And one thing we noticed was all these organizations centered around migration were working in silos. They were working alone and they were obsessed with their piece of the pie, but weren't connecting to each other. So we brought them all together in, I think it was 2017, the first EU Migration Policy Summit in Brussels. And we started just together trying to co-create what are some of the needs that we had. And the big thing we identified was when we got everyone together to kind of view the problem, we started seeing a much more complex problem than what individuals were seeing. And once people start seeing a bigger problem, they realize they have to work with one another. And so this is one of the circles we were working in. And one thing that's pretty clear as soon as you look at this, although there are some people from migrant background in this circle, there's not a lot. You can see that, right? Just in the color of the skin and kind of how people are dressed. And that was sort of the first thing we noticed as we looked at the problem together was we didn't have all the right people in the room. We didn't have a lot of leaders from migrant background. They weren't represented. They weren't speaking up. They weren't leading organizations. And that really shifted the entire way we set up Hello Europe. And I'll talk a little more about that later. But I just give this example to say, you know, when we actually start looking at the big problems we face, we realize we need collaborative solutions and we need the right people in the room. We need to invite more people in the room normally than what we're used to. So, you know, as we talk about, there's one thing I just wanted to point out to as well is this idea of collective leadership, of being able to lead and to bring people together is key to each one of our, what we call these change-making principles, right? If you think about it, you know, empathy, what's empathy? It's learning to relate to others, to hear them, to understand where they're coming from, to incorporate new perspectives and viewpoints into your work and seeing the world. You need collective leadership. Teamwork, that's kind of the definition of teamwork, right? Knowing how to work with others, having a desire and experience to do it. Teamwork involves giving space to others, ensuring they have support, that they're all participating. Collaborative leadership is kind of, again, the definition of this, leading together with other, building teams of teams rather than just individuals, and creative change making, right? Facing major issues and changing them, not just working together for more profit or for enjoyment, but actually looking at the problem as a whole and how to bring our whole selves to it. Collaborative leadership, co-creation, these are all aspects that are key to change-making principles. So today's session is going to be a lot about that, and we're actually going to experiment with some tools that are actually being developed to help our leadership become better in this. Because a lot of us are used to leading as individuals, a lot of us are used to leading in different groups, but how do we lead together? How do we co-lead? So we're going to explore at least 2 tools today that we're going to go in depth in, and then there's going to be a few other things. But before we launch into the first tool, I also wanted to bring up, or I wanted us to take a second, just like we did with Hello Europe, and step back and think of what are some of the problems, what are some of the issues we're facing as faith communities, or faith communities we're deciding to engage in. And I jotted down just a few examples that basically come out of your applications for this course. That I've put them in different words, but I just want us to think about this for a second and just sit with the depth and the breadth and the complexity of some of the problems we're facing. Let me just read these to you. Perpetuation of stereotypes. Stereotypes that polarize communities and keep them at odds. These stereotypes spilling into schools and relationships, even amongst kids, that inherit their parents' stereotypes and live them out even though they're not based on real experience. Another issue, faith communities that don't care or see the urgency of systemic racism or understand how to play a role in dismantling it. Another issue that came out is, my neighbors, they don't trust or know each other, and there's no culture of caring for each other, making an unsafe neighborhood. Or people suffering mental health, not finding the help that they need, and even being ostracized in their faith communities. Or massive incarceration, which is a big issue in the United States, but also in many other places, and increasingly so. How it breaks up families and entire communities, creating high barriers to reentry. For a second, let's just sit with some of these issues. How do you solve these? Clearly, one organization, one great leader, one politician can't solve these issues. We need complex issues require collaborative solutions. So today, the first tool we want to talk about, or we want to introduce, that's developed to establish environments for better co-creation, is called Theory U. Some of you may be familiar with Theory U. We're going to drop a link into the chat for the Presencing Institute, because there's tons of courses on this. But we wanted to just introduce this tool and play with it a little bit. And to do that, we've invited one of my favorite colleagues. I get to work with Mika a lot because we're both in Europe. Mika Fenech, she's from Malta, based in Malta, and she leads our new leadership and well-being work in Europe, trying to help crazy entrepreneurs like the people that work in Ashoka to have better well-being. It's a high task. It's a very difficult task. And she also co-leads the European Ashoka Fellowship Initiative. So I'm going to pass it over to Mika, and she's going to introduce us to Theory U as one of the tools to help us develop our collaborative leadership. Mika, over to you. Hello,
everyone. I am extremely grateful and excited to be here and connecting with you all. As Kenny mentioned, I lead the well-being and new leadership work that we do in Ashoka, and I'm extremely passionate about the topic because I'm completely attracted to and feel called to really understanding and activating the link between our inner development as human beings and social change. And by inner development, I mean both at the individual level and at the collective evolution level. And I feel like that disconnection is part of why we are where we are today. And so any excuse and opportunity to see how to connect the two is extremely exciting for me. And that's also why I was really excited to join this session, because I feel like this is a community that sees that link and looks to manifest that link as well. So very grateful to be here. As Kenny mentioned, I'm from Malta, which is historically a very Catholic country. So I grew up in the Catholic tradition and the Catholic faith. I then disconnected from the faith for a short while during my teens when I was trying to answer everything for myself. And then realized that all my answers were actually, everything I was looking for was in God. And the sort of Catholic community or the Catholic faith helped me to see that. And so now I'm really trying to keep that deeper relationship and intimacy with God as center to what I do, although it's, you know, the hardest job I find, but the most important. So for that, really excited to be here and to learn from you all. As Kenny mentioned, I'm going to introduce Theory U, which it's true is a tool, but really it starts with a way of seeing. And what I'm going to focus on for this session is more an initial framing to get the essence of the tool. So it is going to feel incomplete because there is so much to go into, but that's also okay because it's part of it in a way. It's part of the tension. And also we're going to share so many tools and links on how to then put it into practice. So that's the plan. And reconnecting back to what Rabbi Sid beautifully said of how do we see the spark of the divine in everyone, and also how do we collectively heal the brokenness that's in this world. I really resonated with that. And also to what Kenny was saying of when we see the complexity and the breadth and the depth of the challenges around us and the disruption around us, there's a moment of humility of seeing that we can't do this alone, but there's also a risk. There's also a moment of fear of how do we actually make this happen. And so what Theory U is trying to do is to help people to see that complexity, but to then move through it into action. And so what Theory U is like a framework and a methodology that really supports groups and collectives to tap into their deeper and more holistic capacities as human beings, individually and collectively, so that they can co-create solutions from that space. And that, they say, makes all the difference in the quality of how we collaborate and what we create together. And this will slowly make more sense as we go on. And basically, Theory U is inviting a new way of seeing ourselves, a new way of seeing each other and the realities around us, by looking at it through our collective lens of the future potential around us. And it's also inviting leaders to wake up to, and change makers to wake up to a deeper level of awareness and to venture more deeply into the source of our behavior and creative process. And in fact, this is what they call the blind, like what they have seen is one of the major blind spots in social change and leadership, which is that we're blind to the source dimension from which effective leadership and social action actually comes into being. And so if you can just change the slide, Kenny? Thank you. So when we know a lot about what we do, like we know a lot about the results of change making. We also increasingly know a lot about how to do it, right? In fact, the next part of this call is going to focus on the processes of change making, different like design thinking tools, prototyping tools that we can use to collaborate. So we know increasingly more about the process, but we are usually least aware of the who. So this inner place, this inner source, this inner condition from which we operate as we engage in change making. So how are we actually showing up? And that matters so much to the quality of what we actually can then bring. What quality of intention or attention or awareness or listening do we bring to a situation? And these feel like subtle things that make all the difference to our interactions. And then a subtle also impact on the courses of action that we take. And again, I'm going to slowly go deeper into this. And I feel like this is can be a very spiritual theory, and they sort of also claim this themselves, or they try to. And I think as people of faith, we probably spend a considerable amount of time actually talking about this source, and not just seeing this source from a human level, but seeing the beyond human or divine level, or the spark of the divine in us all too. And that makes all the difference. And we are seeking to connect with that source and develop a deeper relationship with that source and with ourselves. So I think many of the tools that we will share will feel like tools that feel somehow resonant with what we practice anyway as part of our faith. And so I think it's actually a beautiful connection and intersection that we discuss and embody. And what's also really important about this, and this link to the who, is that it makes sure that we are including ourselves in the systems that we're trying to change. So we're not just seeing a system as an issue out there, external, but that we are part of that system. Not only are we part of that system, we in some way represent that system as well, both individually and collectively. And so individually, this means, how do I bring more awareness to how I am showing up, the assumptions I have, the perspective I have, the biases I have, the patterns, the habits? How do I bring more self-awareness? And then at the collective level, it's how do we bring more dialogue, but not just any kind of dialogue, a deep kind of dialogue that makes us aware of ourselves and how we're interacting. And so if I had to sum up, like, the most important word to me in the context of Theory U, it's really this idea of awareness-based collaboration and keeping that as the foundation. If you can change slide. Okay, so very briefly, this is what they use as a way to describe in a sort of concise way what Theory looks like as a process. And just stepping back again and reconnecting to this idea of how we need, considering the brokenness and healing we see needed in the world, there is profound innovation and profound change and a radical collaboration that's required from us. And that means we need to suspend downloading our patterns of the past that don't serve us. And so I'm not saying that we don't need to connect with the past, especially in the context of the deep inequity and oppression that our communities have experienced. But we also need something else. And what Theory is about is saying that that something else is being able to learn from a future potential that we can collectively see and that we see trying to emerge. It's like when you almost see, even if you just think of like a child that you know and the potential that you see in them, as that's like slowly growing as they define themselves. And that future potential can potentially be tapped into depending on their environment, their choices, their relationships, and everything that comes with it, right? So it's really trying to focus on how do we learn also from this future potential. And what Theory is trying to describe here is a process, but also an inner experience. Again, the thing that we avoid and don't give much, we don't give much attention to, but that is crucial in any context of collaboration. And so as I briefly go through this, I'm going to be sharing a few elements about the process, but also this inner experience and these inner conditions that matter at the different steps. So this curve, as I said, it sort of represents this process of, first and foremost, suspending and downloading, suspending those habits and patterns of the past and not letting them, that don't serve us, of course, and not letting them be the lens through which we see the world and through which we see the problem only. And then once we slowly shed that habit or shed those patterns, and also as we slowly shed our ego as well, or decenter ourselves as the most important perspective, we open up to seeing this potential future and then co-creating from that place. And it's a process that has 5 moments, which I'm going to briefly explain, and then all the material will help you make sense of them and see practices and tools that connect to each moment. So the going down is where, as I said, we're sort of the first part of the U is where we're decentering ourselves and our habits of the past that no longer serve. And what's happening, and maybe Kenny, you can also change the slide now. Not change the slide, like allow the animations to come up. Thank you. And so what's happening is that we're slowly going into deeper levels of awareness at different stages, and deeper levels of awareness where at an individual and at a collective level. So the first step is co-initiating. And here it's all about building a common intention, as we said in the beginning, right? Intention is an essential part. And this is not talking about setting a goal, but really stopping and listening first and foremost to your own intention, your deepest sense of calling and purpose, and allowing others to do the same, and also to listen to each other. And then listening to what is felt and required right now in that moment as you are connecting together. And it's also the place where you start to build a container together to hold this process. Next is where is called co-sensing, and it's specifically co-sensing, not co-thinking, because here we're trying to get out of our bubbles and actually immerse ourselves in new contexts that matter to our situation, but that are unfamiliar. And so here it's really about getting to the edge of what you consider as your system and the most unfamiliar place you can get to, and really try to listen to that perspective through your mind and your heart. And so here we're trying to see the experience, the way different people in the system both see what's happening and feel what's happening. And so that's going to build a very different collective picture. And then the most important is where the bottom, that's like the void, the moment of stillness where we're letting go of what we think we know. We're letting go of what we feel attached to as the right way or a preferred solution, and taking a moment of stillness. A moment, it's what we also call like the creative void, or it's that moment of the blank canvas, which can feel so scary that we want to jump straight into a solution. And what's required here is taking a moment and to be okay with that silence and that stillness and that not rushing to solution, to see to turn our attention inwards and see what our inner knowing is trying to tell us and what is emerging there. And this again can be seen from the human, but also from the human and divine side. And this is where we also can see our essential selves. And then if you go up the U, these are the more common methods and tools in terms of like prototyping and learning by doing, and then scaling and expanding our work. So those are the ones we know more of, and we'll share some practical tools. But what I feel is the most crucial part of this is the inner elements that happen before, and what we're allowing to happen before we step into action. And it's a lot, but hopefully it just gives you a sense, and as long as you take the essence, that's the most important thing. And I'm wondering, because I know we have to save some time, so I'm just going to quickly share that from my perspective as a Christian who very much feels the symbolism and the story of resurrection, I straight away, or almost straight away, associated this with the process of death and resurrection, a death of self that allows for new life to be reborn. The same way that the seed has to die before it can grow. I literally, at least from my experience, I literally see, Easter, Good Friday at the top of the U. I see Easter Saturday, that moment of silence, at that day of silence and darkness at the bottom of the U. And then I see Easter Sunday, and obviously everything they represent towards the top of the U. But that's just me, and I'd love to stop for a second here and just see how this, if you see anything that relates to your faith here, or through the lens of your faith or your faith tradition, do you see how any of this the essence of this relates. And you can type in the chat if so. And just take a moment to see how it might link, or see how everyone else is seeing the connection. Yes, U-theory is hard to use alone, but at the same time, it is something that we personally experience, even just at the moment of meditation, for example, you know, and that experience of meditation. Thank you for sharing, and please keep them going. Kenny, I wonder if you want to quickly share your example or your reflection, and then we can move on.
Yeah, sure. So just another example that came up. I had mentioned the Hello Europe experience before. We were brought together all these leaders from organizations around migration, and we realized pretty visibly that there weren't a lot of people from migrant background in the room. And so one of the things we started to think about is, how do we involve leaders from migrant background into an ecosystem where they haven't been included? And obviously the answer was, we let them create the ecosystem and have them invite us into it, which involved and is involving a lot of this, the curve down for me. Like, how do I empty the thoughts that I had and the ideas I had of how this was supposed to be built, instead to find some of these leaders and sit with them and say, you know, what do you need? What are you looking for? How can we contribute? How can we create something together? And that's actually resulted in a community we call Changemakers for Migration in Europe. And I won't go into detail here, but it's been so interesting because from Ashoka, you know, we have all these ideas of how things should happen and how co-creation should work. And if you just let me lead it, it'll all go out great. But that's not how co-creation works. Often it takes long periods of sitting with people and listening and really understanding what are some of the issues behind it, and letting the ideas of how to create that example to kind of go, or how to create that community to kind of be washed away and to create something new. So, you know, we now have this community in Spain. We started piloting a project of about 30 leaders from migrant background that are creating their own community. And we're part of that community. We're providing resources, providing the space, the connections, but it's a very different experience, and it's actually working much better than inviting leaders from migrant into a room where white men actually make the decision, but they just share their testimony. That didn't work. So, you know, that's a quick example. But Mika, I'll let you take us into kind of the next activity.
Sounds good. So this is where we go back to what was people are saying of the individual experience, and something key to the individual experience is awareness of our openness. And theory talks about openness in 3 levels, and you sort of go deeper with each level. And these are relevant for like the foundational activities which we engage in to collaborate: listening, communication, and organizing, right? So one is having an open mind, this idea of removing our habits and our assumptions of what we know, and not only seeing our truth as one truth, and being open to different truths. The second one is open heart, so developing the capacity to see an issue through the lens of another person and through their own experience. And being able to suspend our voice of cynicism and judgment, or our emotional distancing that happens, or the us versus them that sometimes kicks in when we feel unsafe. Seeing how we can hear that through compassion and expand our sense of compassion to whoever we might be listening to, even if it's someone we don't like or someone who has hurt us. And then the deepest level is open will, which links a lot to our intuition as well. And it's this capacity to fully let go of what we attach to our identity, that emptying that was also mentioned, to see what new can emerge. And this comes with meeting the voice of fear with courage, that voice of fear of rejection, of failure, of death, that happens in that moment where we need to let go of ourselves and our ego. And this is just helping to see what is happening at the individual level when we are trying to listen or communicate with openness and show up with openness. And as I said, like this is easier when we're speaking to someone we resonate with, and much more challenging when we're speaking to someone we don't know, we don't like, or we don't trust, or like I said, has hurt us. And which is all required in the context of the kind of collaboration that we need and the healing that we need. And so, as we mentioned at the beginning, key to this process is redirecting our attention inwards and asking ourselves, even for today, what are we bringing to this conversation today? What are we assuming works? What are we assuming is the right way? What kind of hidden priorities are we holding on to? And what else might be shaping our perspective? And taking the intention to collectively let that go and not let that block the potential of what we can co-create together. And so what I'm going to do is actually take a moment and share a few questions for you to reflect on, like literally a minute, and then we'll go into breakouts. And I'm also going to put them into the chat. So just take a second, maybe have a journal or just however you feel you'd like to reflect. What are you feeling as you listen to what has been shared? What habits might be kicking in? Any biases or preferences, resistance? And what might be any hidden priorities that you have or agendas? And so as we engage in the next hour, which is going to be focusing on putting ourselves in our learning groups and discussing the problems that we see, and using different maps to help do that. The question that we'd love you to take to your breakouts is, what are you bringing and what are you willing to let go of that might be in service of deeper connection and co-creation? And you have a few minutes each. You'll be in pairs or in threes to reflect on this together. I just want to check with the team if it's still 8 minutes or if you want to adapt that.
Let's make it 6.
Okay.
Just reduce that a little bit.
It's going to be six minutes together. And like I said, focus on both the question, but also how you approach, how you show up in your listening. Enjoy.
Resume recording.
Great. So as you're all coming back, as you're gathering back in, jot down in the chat, what are some of the interests or issues you're bringing and putting aside? What were some of the things that came up in the group? Please add those to the chat because we'd love to just hear from you. What are the things that came up? So again, as more and more of you are returning, if you could just share in the chat, what are some of the things that came up in the group regarding what you're bringing, what's your intention, what you feel is being called out from you. So I'm reading some of this stuff, leading the conversation as one of the things we often bring. We're used to doing that. Difficulty with intentional conversations, the need to step back and open up genuine dialogue and connection. Learning again about letting go as an individual to kind of collect as a whole. And there's so much in the chat, it's hard to read. This is really great. Death of self is quite difficult. I think it is the most difficult. Commitment to embodying a personal practice for spiritual growth. Committing to that open and honest dialogue. The importance of an orientation of humility, curiosity, beginner's mind, not knowing. This is all great. Thank you all so much. Please feel free to keep adding stuff to that. And we'll move on kind of to the second section here. Well, let me tell you, co-creation is really hard. It's very difficult. I think all of you know this because you've probably been involved in some way or another. But I also think faith communities have some of the knowledge to do this better than other communities. Why? Because we're trained to stop, to look inward, to identify things we need to let go of, and then to regather and bring people together. These are actually key practices for co-creation. And working in the field of social innovation with a lot of people from different backgrounds, I can tell you, when people of faith and spiritual disciplines are in the group and are in the co-creation process, it often is much more rich. And there's often a lot of guidance into that, and not exemplary behavior, but an ability to kind of look inward much more quickly. In fact, Mika and I were talking the other day about what it's like. We were just in a conversation, and I won't share anything, personal, but we were sharing what it's like to be a person of faith in a sector where often it's kind of perceived as something negative to be a person in faith, as is the case in the social sector in lots of places in Europe. And we said, when you actually start bringing your world of faith and intimate kind of inward looking into the world of social work, suddenly these connections start happening and a lot more richness starts happening. So that's just one of the things we bring into this theory, you and other pieces. A lot of you have these gifts and have these disciplines in your hands that the sector and your neighborhoods and your organizations and the world needs. Please bring those to the table. But there's another thing we have, and as faith communities, and it's something that some people have called prophetic imagination. I believe Walter Brueggemann is the first person to coin this phrase, but I'm not sure. But what's prophetic imagination? It's the ability to think, to dream, to activate realities that weren't available before. Brueggemann actually says that prophetic imagination it's someone who not only embraces the pain of the people, so that's the first part, that empathy, embracing the pain of the people, but also creates an energy and an amazement based on the new thing that God is doing. Let me just say that again, but creates an energy and amazement based on the new thing that God is doing, the new thing that's emerging, the new thing that's coming from another dimension, so to speak. The prophetic imagination, the prophetic voice is able to sit in the pain with a community that's in pain, but also imagine a different future. And in this initiative, and that's a key skill to change making, essentially, is a prophetic imagination. In our faith-inspired change-making initiative, we often refer to this, or the way we work on this prophetic imagination is through something we call how might we questions. These are questions that we are great to do with your team, and we bring teams together to kind of think of, first, what is the root of the problem? Who's affected by the problem? What are they feeling? And then to build the question, what is the new reality that we want to see out of this community? Here, let me just show you a couple examples from other sessions we've done in different settings of some of these how might we questions. For example, one that came out with working with young people is, how might we enable young people in faith communities to develop their change-making, empathy, teamwork, collaborative leadership, and creative problem solving, and put it into practice with a supportive multi-generational group of allies? Another question, the second one here, how might we build communities of faith where it is a normal part of life for all members to find deep meaning, and support in discovering their spark and putting it in action to serve those around them? There's a few more here. And by the way, I'm going to share these slides with everyone so you can read them. But other kinds of how might we questions. For example, the first one here, how might we completely transform the way we work with our homeless population, ridding ourselves of paternalism and service that doesn't entrust responsibility to them? Or how do we empower them as part of the solution? How might we release resources that we have as a faith community for our neighbors in order to support their projects and dreams for their community? You see how these are framing or thinking of new realities from the problem that we're identifying. So today we want to spend just a little bit of time working towards some of these how might we questions. And to do that, I want to introduce design thinking. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of people here have had some experience with design thinking, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time in design thinking. We'll use a tool in particular. But just as a brief introduction, design thinking was originally developed by IDEO Design Studio, which is linked to the Stanford University now, is now used everywhere or in a lot of places. The main idea is a human-centered design. What does that mean? That we design products and services to empower people in communities, cities, and countries. And these people, the users, or the clients, the users, right? That whoever is benefiting from that are actually part of the process themselves. So it's kind of flipping the table. Also, it builds on the idea of collaboration as the key to success. Kind of this idea, complex problems must be solved collaboratively. And finally, it involves a constant process of diverging, of going out and looking for what's around, what are good ideas, what's creative, and then converging, bringing that together, summarizing it, reducing it, diverging, converging. So brief definition, there's a lot of stuff online. There's a couple links in here. How do we want to use it today? Well, we're actually going to just use one tool that we want to play with. It's called the empathy map. And let me just share from my personal experience, this is probably the tool that has been most helpful to me in almost every aspect of leadership in what I do. And what is an empathy map? An empathy map is basically a sheet of paper you put on a wall. Now we're going to do it online, which has its challenges. But where we think of a person that's affected by the problem, we interview them, we talk to them, and then we bring all that back and try to figure out how are they thinking and feeling? What are they hearing? What are they saying and doing? What are they seeing as they approach this issue? So I'm going to share a different part of my screen for a second here. And in a minute, we're going to go into groups and actually work on this, but I want to show you how we're going to do this. So give me 1 second. Here we go. So hopefully you can see my screen here. What we're going to do, because we're all at a distance, is we're going to use a tool called Jamboard, which is from the Google Suite. And it's basically a board where everyone can put stuff on at the same time. And we're going to build this empathy map. So the first thing you do to build an empathy map is identify what is the problem we're trying to deal with. What is the problem we're approaching? And just for ease and for time's sake, we've defined a problem for you. Okay, so that PDF that you got before that has a link and a problem, when you go to that link, which you can either go to now or in a second, you'll see in the first page the problem. Now here I've made an example that I'll describe in a second, but the problem is just a basic definition of what is the problem we're addressing. In this case, as I explain this, I'm going to use the example of Raj Jayadev. Remember from the first day we saw that video of Raj Jayadev, and what he was doing is helping family members of people facing incarceration to connect with others and to build kind of the full picture of who their family member is so that judges and juries can make better decisions. Now, for Raj Jayadev, we could define the problem as unreasonable sentences are being applied to low-income people and a lack of ability to influence or play a role in the process. Just really brief problem. Again, you'll have this in your sheet. The second step that we do is define the person or the persona. So who is a person actually affected by this problem? And in Raj Jayadev's example, we pulled out a person. We made this person up. I don't think she exists in the world, but I just made her up to kind of fit with what are the kind of people that he's working with. And so this person, her name is Alicia Vidal. She's 35 years old. She has 3 kids, 4, 6, and 9 years old. And her husband, Mariano Perez, is facing possible incarceration for a crime he accidentally committed. Other notes, she's Latina in a neighborhood in the United States. She's been in the neighborhood for 10 years, knows lots of people, but as this process is happening, she's feeling alone in this situation. So once you do that, and we're going to put you in groups in a second and ask you to come up with this persona, you go to your empathy map, which is this thing here, and you start filling it up with Post-it notes. And so you'll see something like this on your sheet, and in a second, I'll explain you how to get there. But I did this about Alicia Vidal. So we started thinking, for this woman, what is she hearing in this process? And we built these notes. We said something like, well, you'll never win. That's the first thing she's hearing as she's listening to other cases, to other people that have been through the process. You're not going to win this case. Give up. She's hearing prison for many years. That's going to be the result. But she's also hearing, hey, this judge might have compassion. You might be lucky. She's hearing, hey, your husband's story matters. And we think a little broadly, like, what is she seeing? Well, she's seen people of color in her community having longer sentences than what's reasonable. She's seen children without a father grow up. She's seeing an income reduction. Even with her 2 jobs, without her husband, she can't make it. What is she thinking and feeling? Well, she's feeling alone. You know, she's feeling helpless. She's feeling desperate. And again, this exercise, what we did is we just tried to put ourselves in her skin and think, what is she thinking and feeling, and organize those notes. And then here at the bottom, we have these categories. What are the pains and gains in this process? As she's going into the process of building the story of her husband, what are some of the pains? Well, there's extra expenses. There's more hours invested. There's uncertainty. What are some of the gains? Well, she's finally feeling understood. There's a potential positive outcome. She's in company of others, etc. So this is what we're looking to build, is this empathy map to kind of understand who this person is and what they're facing. So now with that, it shows a bit of picture. We're going to send you in a second into your groups again. And if you got that PDF and you found your name, we want you to click on the link in that. And the link will show you something like this. This is the first group. You'll have the problem up here. And what we want you to do is for the first 2 minutes to ask someone in the group, hey, for this problem, do you know anyone who's having this problem? And tell us about that person. So let's take this group, for example. The problem is children and youth in marginalized communities have restricted access to quality education and skills building opportunities. So say we were in a group with myself, with Anne, with Mika and Mentor, and we'd say, does anyone know a children or young person in a marginalized community with this issue? And Mentor says, I do. I have a friend whose son, Miroslav, is in a situation like this. He's 12. He wanted to study music, but there's no access to music studies and he's really discouraged. Okay, we'll fill that in here. So you double click on it and say Miroslav, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that'll be the first 3 minutes of your group, is to just define this. The easiest way is if someone knows a person, just put that person in, make up a different name if you want so that you protect their anonymity, but describe this person. Once you do that, you see up here where you have these frames. And again, I apologize if this is technologically complex. If this isn't working for you later, just do it on a sheet of paper. But you'll go to the second frame. And on this, you'll see your empathy map. And so what we want you to do there, once you're here and you're thinking of that person, we want each one of you, we want you all to take 2 minutes in silence. And for each of you to think of 3 or 4 things, you know, something they're thinking, something they're hearing, saying or doing or seeing, and to make a Post-it note about that. How do you do that? You go over here to the left, right under this arrow, and it says sticky note. You click on that and this screen will appear. And so say we're thinking of this kid who wants to study music. What is he hearing? Friends are studying music. You save that and the note will appear here. So we want all of you to come up with 3 notes, 3 or 4. And again, if the technology isn't working, just write it on a piece of paper. And if someone in your group has better tech skills, let them do that, or you can just do it on a piece of paper. And once you have these notes for the last part, which is about 10 minutes, we want you, each one of you, to take a turn and say, here are my 3 notes. For example, I'm seeing friends are studying music, and you can organize that into the here section, or into think of feel section, or into the see section, or the pains and gains. At the end, you'll have something that looks a lot like this. You don't have to do all the nice colors and stuff like this. I just made this like this for more visual appeal, but we want you to come up with an empathy map. Let me stop for just a second and ask my team at least, is there any explanation or any piece that might be more helpful to describe at this point?
I think we have a couple of groups that need to have the file open for them.
We can do that.
Put in the chat if you're having a problem, that would be great.
Yeah. So what we'll do now, thanks, Anne. What we'll do now is we'll all send you to your groups. And if you can click on the link that you've already seen in the PDF document, you go to this. If you can't find it, there's probably someone in your group who can. So just ask, who's the tech person here? Help us with this. And spend the first 2 minutes just figuring out if someone knows a person, or if not, make this person up who's affected by the problem. And again, this problem may not be something that affects you directly or whatever. We're just learning to do this together. And then once you have that, once you fill this out, go to the empathy map. Spend 2 minutes, each of you thinking of 2 or 3 ideas, put them on Post-it notes and then organize them. And please, if this isn't working, someone just do it on a sheet of paper and write it down and take a picture later. It's fine. If we were together, we do it on a wall. I teach you how to post Post-its without them being knocked off by the wind and all that fun stuff with design thinking. But for now, we're going to try this technological challenge. So please go to your groups. If you can't figure it out, just ask us or ask for help in your group, and we'll come get you. This is a technological experience and experiment. So we're hoping it works. And then we'll come back and we'll share a bit of this and send you back to group for one last thing. All right, let's do it. If we're able to. Hi, everyone.
Hello, Sandra.
As you're returning, first of all, thank you for doing this experiment with us, with this technology and everything. I know for some people it's probably frustrating. This is the hardest workshop I've done in my life, to try to get so many people in groups with so many different levels. So yeah, as you're all coming back, I'm just saying I'm so proud of everyone here, because I know this is such a hard exercise to get into the groups and mess with that. And I see about 80% of the groups got information onto the sheet, which is a huge feat. I do encourage you, as you're coming back, the Jamboard is a great tool if you want to use with smaller groups. If you have a group of 5 or 6 or 2 or 10 and you divide into 2, it's a lot easier to manage them with 70 some odd people. But as you're coming back, if you were able to get to the point where you were starting to think of, okay, now that we've defined what the reality for this person is, what is the how might we question? If you were able to define that or articulate that, or if you could even take a moment now and think, what is that how might we question for the person, for the problem in our group, we'd love to see those in the chat, to just jot some down. I know some of you probably didn't have time to think that far ahead, but let's just take a minute. And if you were able to articulate a bit of that, how might we question around, you know, this person, this situation, what it would look like, I'd love to read out some of those from the chat. And as you're doing that, just again to say thank you so much for your patience with this and trying this technological approach. Design thinking is really hard to do with people in the same room. When you try to do it across the world with different groups and people that don't know each other with an online platform, it gets more complicated, but it is possible. So thank you so much. And again, what we want to do is introduce you to some of these tools that can be helpful for collective thinking, so that you can use it and take these immediately back to your communities or space and use them in different ways. We've found some of them really helpful. Let me just read some of these questions that are emerging. And again, we're just asking people if you were able to articulate or you want to, and how might we question for your group. So how might we encourage those at the end of their careers as faith leaders to take risks? Ooh, that can be a painful one to ask. How might we help Joseph avoid falling back into the life out of pure despair? How might we affect change with those fast food companies having the worst environmental footprint? How might we work with John to solve the problem instead of solving it for him? How might we help create children from different culture find healthy friendships? How might we support Layla so that she can be her authentic self? How might we help John and his family to have access to affordable and qualitative food? How might we make adults in our community open to empower young people? How might we create opportunities for young people to practice power? These are good. These are good. How might we start believing and living like we're all in this together? How might we help older church leaders work with younger congregants? It's good questions. And again, what our experience is if you're able to spend more time with an activity like an empathy map, where you're forced to kind of go actually to the community members that are involved and interview them and ask them, and even ask them to participate in creating their own empathy map, you're surprised by things that come up that you hadn't thought of before. You start seeing aspects to it that are different. And then with your team, as you start creating that how might we question, you start imagining a future together. And one of the things we want to encourage you to do and also to think about is what we've found is if you get the right people in the room, the how might we question that emerges is really powerful. but it's really important to be able to identify who are the right people that need to be in this room, who are the users, the people that this is actually affecting, and ensure it's not a few leaders, deciding for the rest of the community. So thank you so much for using that tool. We've thrown a few resources into WeChangers, and there's a lot more online to work with that. And just as we wrap this up really quickly, what did we learn today? There's a few things that we've looked at. First of all, we've learned a little bit on how to practice collective impact and action skills together. And hopefully this develops even more. We've also learned some basic principles and tools related to theory U, or to U theory, and design thinking. We've started identifying some key issues with prophetic and how to create prophetic imagination questions. And hopefully most of us have experienced how to build an empathy map as a resource to diverge, to ask questions, to interview people, and then converge these ideas into a prototype. These are some tools and ways of thinking for change making, both to go deeper within oneself, to better prepare for co-creation, there's the U theory, but also to build a team and to work together in defining and solving problems. And again, we've shared more of these tools on the platform. Just a couple of things as we end. One, where can we develop more tools, or where are more tools available? First of all, this week, we're going to launch the registration for our Faith-Inspired Changemakers Lab. And the lab is taking this to another level. If you actually have an idea or working with a team to develop an organization, we invite you to apply for the Changemakers Lab. We'll drop the registration link into WeChangers this week. You should get a notification if you're online. Apply for that. We'll go deeper into empathy maps, into design thinking, into some of the tools to actually build your organization. The other thing we wanted to ask for is a lot of you know tools like these and other tools that are related to faith, that are related to change making. Share those with us. Share those with the community. We'd really like to gather them. If you could put them into WeChangers, we want to build a comprehensive list of what's available for faith communities and for faith-inspired change makers. And then just looking forward to next week, first of all, we're putting the survey link in the chat. If you could please fill that out, that's really helpful for us. Any kind of feedback, and we're asking you some questions about the session today and going forward. And then next, what's next? Next week, we're going to be exploring 3 more things. One thing is our changemakers journey. What were the events and the things that brought us to become the changemakers that we are? We find that's a key tool for changemakers. So next week, we're going to go back to the individual in a sense. What's your organization? What's your idea? What's the thing you're working on? Where does that come from? We're also going to introduce systems change thinking, and in particular, the 5 R's framework, which is kind of figuring out what's the system you're working in and what needs to change. And we'll have a bit more of a discussion on how to keep empowering change makers in our communities. So as we prepare for that, and as we end, and as you fill out the surveys, just one last thing we'd like to do. Thinking forward on next week, as we're going to think about our journeys of change making, I'd like you to just take a second and think of one person in your life that inspired you to become the change maker you are today. Probably as I say that, someone jumps into your head, you have an image of that person, you have a name. I'd love for you to just describe that person for us in the chat. You can name them, you can say my mom, my youth leader, my whatever, but name that person, kind of honor them in this context. And if you're able to this week, commit to reach out to them and just thank them for their influence over you, for helping you along in your journey. So with that, we're going to end, and I encourage you, if you need to jump off, that's fine, but please fill out the survey and also read some of these answers of the amount of people and the type of people that have inspired us to become change makers. Thank you all so much for spending this hour and a half with us today and for engaging in new technology. Looking forward to see you next week.